The United Kingdom of Great Britain and the French Republic had been at each other's throats for nearly a decade. Doing battle on the high seas, on the fields of Flanders, upon the sands of Egypt, by 1801 the great enemies of Western Europe had found themselves at a stalemate. Britain unable to match France's mighty army, and France thwarted in her attempts to break the Royal Navy's stranglehold on trade and movement. Peace was on the cards for both, and as we've seen, First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte was ready to bury the hatchet. But the British still fancied themselves in the stronger position. Russia, under the thumb of Emperor Alexander I, reconciled with Britain, all but withdrawing from the League of Armed Neutrality formed by his father. Thus, on April 1st, when a formidable fleet under Admirals Hyde Parker and Horatio Nelson sailed into Copenhagen, Russia did not interfere. The Danish-Norwegian fleet was sunk at anchor to deny this powerful force to anybody, French, Danish, Russian, or otherwise. The success of this surprise attack encouraged the British to demand peace from the French. Robert Jenkinson, Lord Hawkesbury, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, made it known in March 1801 that if the French evacuated Egypt, his government might be willing to end the war. What they weren't willing to do was return any of the French and Dutch colonial territories captured during the course of the war. Territories which included Martinique, Tobago, Trinidad, Demerara, and Guyana, as well as the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and Ceylon and Pondicherry in India. Naturally, Napoleon refused this ridiculous offer, which amounted to a surrender in all but name. Like the British, Napoleon was under the impression that he was the one arguing from a position of strength. The continent was his, the army clung onto Egypt, and Sweden, Prussia, and Russia were all still closed to British trade. Joachim Murat had defeated the Neapolitans at the Battle of Siena in January 1801, enforcing a tough peace at the Treaty of Florence. Then Portugal, Britain's last remaining continental ally, was invaded by Spain, beginning the brief War of the Oranges. Though a promising start to the year, one by one all of these advantages would wane. On April 24th, Napoleon sent his young aide-de-camp, Gerard de Rock, to Berlin to treat with Friedrich Wilhelm III and Alexander. These overtures went nowhere, as the Prussians and Russians were quite standoffish. Then in May, Sweden and Prussia quit the League. Russia followed suit next month. The short-lived and impotent League of Armed Neutrality was a dead letter. Down in Portugal, Spain's Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy, wasn't too keen on the fight. Lisbon and Madrid made a peace at Badajoz without Napoleon's permission. It was now on Egypt that Napoleon rested his hopes, but since Jacques Menu barely had the strength to hold on to Alexandria, it was imperative reinforcements be sent at once. However, all of Napoleon's admirals, Eustache Barrix, Pierre Villeneuve, and Honoré Gontem, conspired to obfuscate these plans. Despite Napoleon's incessant demands, the admirals didn't want to lose more money and lives to a lost cause. Their obstinance saved the first consul from himself. Menu surrendered Alexandria in September. Despite now playing with a much weaker hand, Napoleon was all in. He refused to make a disadvantageous peace. The sticking point now was Malta. For as long as the Royal Navy controlled the strategically located island, they could dominate the central Mediterranean. By August, Hawkesbury signalled that the British were willing to restore Malta to the Knights. In exchange, Napoleon offered to evacuate Naples, the Papal States, and Egypt. It was the deal both sides had been seeking. On October 1st, 1801, the 15 articles of the Preliminaries of London were ratified. Among these articles were agreed the return of lost overseas territories. Everything except for the former Dutch colonies of Trinidad and Ceylon would be restored. It would seem then that the French had gotten the better half of this deal, but appearances deceive. As we've seen, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger was something of a hardliner as concerned France, and wasn't willing to make a peace on anything other than the most favourable terms for Britain. But as the war dragged on, and with peace tantalisingly close, doves from within Pitt's own Tory party began to carry the day. The fact was that Pitt's central foreign policy aim, the containment of the French Republic, had been a dismal failure. And what's more, Britain was beginning to feel the economic and social pain of nearly a decade of constant war. Harvests in 1799 and 1800 were poor, and opportunities for trade with the European continent scarce, leading to a general economic downturn. The national debt ballooned to twice its pre-war size, as various factories, businesses, and enterprises shut down. To stay above water, businesses slashed their wages, but in doing so only infuriated workers who were already barely making ends meet. The result was a natural uptick in labour agitation all across Britain. These movements had been mostly stamped out by 1799 and the heavy-handed combination law, which, among other things, banned labour organisation. Compounding domestic unrest was a widespread rebellion in Ireland, an open wound that the French had poured money and manpower into. Overall, the United Kingdom's ability to wage war was seriously hampered. Public and political opinion favoured peace. Dovish sentiment coalesced around Speaker of the House Henry Addington, a long-serving and respected politician. Pitt increasingly found himself on the outside looking in as King George III listened intently to other favoured advisors and ministers. King and Prime Minister came to blows most especially over the question of Catholic rights in Ireland. After the 1800 Act of Union was ratified, Pitt considered it vital to extend civil rights and freedom of conscience to the Irish so as to bring them back into the fold. George, afflicted by a grab bag of mental disorders, refused to even consider such a proposal. In protest, Pitt resigned. Addington took over in March 1801. He was just in time to make peace with Napoleon, and of course offered more concessions than Pitt likely would have. But he didn't give away the barn. Losing out on rich colonial possessions only seems like a dud deal in isolation. As it was, Addington exchanged the colonies for the Mediterranean. Napoleon agreed to withdraw fully from the region, as we saw on the promise that Malta be relinquished. But Addington, the Admiralty and the government were all too aware of Malta's importance. They would never truly give up on Malta, and in the coming years the Mediterranean will become little more than a British lake. The details of the looming peace treaty were hashed out over the next few months, dignitaries and diplomats rushing back and forth from London to Paris and vice versa. General Charles Cornwallis, the very same Cornwallis who had surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, landed in Calais to negotiate with Joseph Bonaparte. Their diplomacy concluded, the Finnish treaty was unveiled at Amiens on March 25, 1802. Though Amiens secured peace, confirming all of the territorial shifts we talked about, it didn't go much further than that. Unlike with Campo Formio and Luneville, Britain only agreed to a de facto French hegemony over the Low Countries, Switzerland and Italy. The condition was that France would withdraw her garrisons, whereupon Britain would acknowledge the Helvetic, Cisalpine and Batavian republics, by admission therefore accepting that France's natural borders extended to the Rhineland. In a show of goodwill, France would compensate Prince William V of Orange, who had been exiled to London since 1795. Britain too would begin the process of divesting from Hanover, as Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia viewed the region as within his sphere of influence. In the main though, the Treaty of Amiens was quite sparse. No provisions were made for trade, since Napoleon was rightfully wary of unscrupulous British merchants, swooping in to take advantage of a France desperate for consumer goods. He had the interests of his own merchants to consider after all, and thus favoured a policy of mercantilism. Tariffs on British goods would be raised, and no special trading privileges extended to British interests. This naturally infuriated those British merchant interests, who struggled to see a silver lining in the peace. In France too, generals like Victor Moreau and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte could envision no better way to rise in power and influence than through battlefield success. Peace ill-suited the warmakers. Ideological exceptionalists from both sides of the Channel likewise didn't place much stock in the peace. Sir Thomas Grenville called it, quote, a most lamentable affair. French diplomat and one of Napoleon's aides-de-camp, Jacques Lauriston, delivered the ratification to London and had been carried by ecstatic crowds. In Paris, Napoleon attended the opera, revelling in standing ovations to the thrice-time peacemaker. Nearly 70,000 French prisoners, incarcerated in fetid conditions, now repatriated to France and returned to their families, were yet another reason for the people to celebrate. With peace restored, Napoleon's focus shifted away from Europe entirely and towards the Western Hemisphere. Longany maintained colonial ambitions, the extent of which is not entirely clear since, as we're about to see, he stumbles out of the gate. But there are hints at what might have been. With the Treaty of San Ildefonso exchanging Tuscany for Louisiana, Napoleon made a strong claim to reassert French presence on the North American mainland. This was a precursor to A. revitalising French trade to the Americas, B. putting pressure on the British in the Americans, and C. attaining dominance in the Gulf of Mexico more generally. There were also endeavours further afield, even as far as the Pacific. With Pondicherry restored, the French had bases from which to explore the South Pacific and the recently colonised island continent of Australia. Napoleon ordered surveys and expeditions of the region, poring over maps from the La Perouse expedition, sizing up the possibility of a colony. He also held explorers in high regard, even making the positively ancient Louis-Antoine Bougainville, a renowned explorer and the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe, into a senator. These forays never panned out, with Napoleon sticking to the Western Hemisphere. As a springboard for his colonial ambitions, it was necessary to reassert control of the Caribbean. Before war with Britain, France possessed several islands in the region, all lucrative sugar and coffee producers. Now that most had been returned, Napoleon sought to restart their precious output. There was just one small problem. Every one of these islands, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, relied upon African slave labour to maintain output. And in 1794, the National Convention had emancipated every single one of them. The largest and most prosperous of these colonies by far was Saint-Domingue. Responsible for over a third of France's colonial trade, mostly in sugar, indigo and coffee, Saint-Domingue had been in the grips of a slave revolt since 1791. White planters were generally confined to the port cities of Le Cap, today's Cap Haïtien, and Port Républicain, the city formerly known as Port-au-Prince. The slaves, meanwhile, or rather the former slaves, had burned plantations to the ground and taken control of the interior. Saint-Domingue they now renamed to Haïti, or Haiti, a bastardization of an indigenous name for the island. Attempts by successive royal and then revolutionary governments to either end the revolt and return the slaves to work, or give in to their demands and free them, had all failed. To make things worse for Paris, Spain and Britain had become deeply involved. Spain had a proximate interest in the revolt as they controlled most of the island of Santo Domingo, and their funding of royalist former slaves in the interior had only ended after their defeat in 1795. Meanwhile, the British had established themselves in the port of Jérémie to prevent a similar revolt from breaking out in their own sugar-producing colony of Jamaica. Even the Americans stuck their nose in, playing both sides by offering aid to the ousted white planters, and later selling arms and ammunition to the rebels. This complex story, complicated further by race, religion and ideology, is nowadays summed up as the Haitian Revolution, the first and only successful slave revolt in the colonial history of the Americas. It's a fascinating, understudied and important story that we simply don't have the time to get into. What's important to know now is what Haiti looked like in late 1800, as Napoleon is gearing up to reassert the metropole's control. By this stage, Haiti was ruled by the intelligent and principled Toussaint Louverture, a former waiter turned revolutionary. Born in Le Cap in 1743, Toussaint had outmaneuvered, outwitted or outlasted most of his contemporaries. As a literate and charismatic man, Toussaint quickly made himself invaluable as a leader, graduating to control of an entire army. He took money and guns from the Spanish, but upon promises of emancipation from the new French Republic, turned against his former paymasters and pledged himself to liberté, égalité and fraternité. Most recently, Toussaint defeated his friend-turned-enemy André Rigaud in the brutal War of the Knives. With Rigaud exiled in early 1800, Toussaint consolidated control with the aid of a powerful and well-drilled army. He invaded Santo Domingo late in the year, so that by early 1801, he was in total control of the island, for what it was worth. Most of the original white population had fled or been killed, of 40,000, 10,000 or so remaining in 1801. Mixed race and free coloureds, who dominated the officer corps and administration of the new regime, numbered north of 30,000. And as for the former slaves, in the fight for their freedom, as many as 200,000 had died, out of an original population of 500,000. Now in Haiti's transition from war to peace, Toussaint continued to govern as a general, instituting a military dictatorship. His rule was iron-fisted and personalist. Zero control was exerted by Paris. Haiti was, for all intents and purposes, an independent state. Demonstrating this independence, Toussaint promulgated a constitution for Haiti. The idea was to preempt Napoleon's own constitution of Year 8, which Toussaint rightly suspected would not commit to emancipation for Haitians. Napoleon's opinion of Toussaint was less than enlightened. He was unable to see in Toussaint a civil military leader not unlike himself, who had led his nation to independence and people to emancipation. A black consul, as the eminent Toussaint biographer C.L.R. James famously remarked. Rather, Napoleon saw a rival. James and other historians have been quick to attribute this aversion to racism on Napoleon's part. Cited is the purchasing of slaves in Egypt or the shabby treatment of Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Whilst it is true that Napoleon freed many slaves, and that Dumas was known to second-guess his general, accusations of racism do tar Napoleon quite badly. I defy you to find anybody from the 18th or 19th century that isn't racist by today's standards. And by the standards of his day, Napoleon wasn't particularly racist. He didn't hate people of other races or ethnicities, but by the same token could not rid himself of a sense of European and white exceptionalism. The idea that Toussaint, a very dark-skinned black man of African descent, could possess the positive qualities of an equivalent European was not something Napoleon thought likely, despite the standout examples of mixed race and black Frenchmen in service with his own army. Put simply, he did not trust Toussaint. Napoleon mistakenly believed that the shrewd Toussaint stood between him and his colonial ambitions. Suspecting an invasion but hoping to avoid it, Toussaint went on a charm offensive. He began a pleasant correspondence with both Napoleon and Josephine. Napoleon barely responded, but Josephine, as you may recall, was a Creole, meaning she was born in the Americas, specifically on Martinique. Her family owned some plantations in Haiti, which Toussaint maintained at his own expense, sending the proceeds on to France. Toussaint hoped that his gestures of goodwill would be enough to convince Napoleon to either recognise emancipation, or at the very least return his two sons who were being educated in France, essentially held as hostages. Seeing these overtures going nowhere, Toussaint then sent an emissary to France, Colonel Vincent. Vincent had been in Haiti since 1796, proving a consummate ally to emancipation. It was against Vincent's advice that Toussaint promulgated his own constitution, Vincent rightly predicting that this would make Napoleon irreconcilable. At the very least, Vincent hoped that he could convince Napoleon not to reimpose slavery, but by the time he arrived in France in mid-1801, it was already too late. In trying to convince Napoleon that working with Toussaint would restore Haiti to France, Vincent overstepped, for which he was banished to the island of Elba. Legally, Napoleon had every right to do what he wanted in the colonies. In his Constitution of Year 8 was an article that clearly stipulated, colonies shall be governed by special laws and provisions. Special laws and provisions up to and including a reimposition of slavery. That meant sending a military expedition to Haiti. Slavery would be reimposed gradually, and until it was, Napoleon strung along Vincent and others with assurances that he had no such intentions. All the while, troops, supplies and ships were gathered at the ports of Brest and Rochefort. It was the largest expeditionary force ever assembled in France to that point. 20,000 troops from France, Poland, Switzerland and the Batavian Republic. Veterans of the Italian and Egyptian campaigns, like Boudet, Boyer and de Goua, as well as Leclerc and Hibbert, would lead the divisions. Second in command was a flamboyant Donatien Rochambeau, son of old General Rochambeau. The younger Rochambeau had experience in the Americas, having served with his father in America's War of Independence, and later as the governor of Martinique. Overall command of this expedition chopped and changed a fair bit, but at the last minute Napoleon named his brother-in-law and comrade from Italy and Egypt, Charles Leclerc, to lead the expedition. And it's here that Captain General Leclerc's true nature was revealed. A handful of Toussaint's allies, even at this 11th hour, tried to reason with Leclerc and insist that cooperation, not conquest, would net better results. At this Leclerc scoffed, and described Toussaint and the Haitians in truly reprehensible terms. It was a foreboding portent. Diplomatic assurances from Louis-Guillaume Otto to Lord Hawkesbury that this expedition was about suppressing a slave revolt and not, say, conquering Jamaica, kept the Royal Navy at bay as the expedition departed. The 44 ships of the Leclerc expedition set sail in December 1800, under the overall command of Admirals Villeray-Joyeuse and Louis Treville. In addition to thousands of soldiers, members of the expedition included many of Toussaint's old political rivals, like André Rigaud and Alexandre Pétion, as well as his two sons. Pauline Leclerc, née Bonaparte, accompanied her husband too. Both she and Charles expected this to be over very soon, and would live with the finest European frippery in the meantime. As the expedition dashed across the Atlantic, Toussaint prepared. Knowing that it might get ugly, he'd purchased 30,000 muskets from American traders and fortified a string of defences along the Haitian interior. His best generals, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, were positioned at major ports to throw back landings. But Toussaint faced resistance. Not only were Christophe and Dessalines eager to step out from under the Black Consul's shadow, but Moise, Toussaint's adoptive nephew, staged a revolt in the northern province. For the average Haitian, toiling away on a plantation, emancipation had meant little substantive change in their daily lives. Now, instead of working for white masters as a slave, they worked for mixed-race men, mostly of Toussaint's officer corps, as a slave in all but name. And though Toussaint let the workers keep a larger share of their proceeds of sugar and tobacco trade, though he let them work plots of land to feed themselves, it was not enough to prevent the outbreak of a major revolt. Toussaint was at Dessalines' wedding when he heard that thousands of rebels, under Moïse's leadership, had trapped Christophe and Le Cap. Converging on the north, the revolt was crushed without mercy and Moïse captured. On Toussaint's orders, his beloved nephew was executed by a firing squad. The first of Villeray's fast frigates anchored off the Haitian coast on January 9th. Leclerc had in hand orders, written personally by Napoleon, dictating how the campaign was to be waged. Napoleon had spent a long while considering how to approach this problem, and came up with a three-pronged approach. Firstly, Leclerc was to land and to make any promises, any deals he needed to in order to keep the peace. The point was to delay fighting until he had control of the ports. After this, he was to order Toussaint and his generals to submit. Failing this, they would be declared traitors and either executed or deported. And lastly, having occupied Haiti and decapitated its leadership, slavery would be reimposed. The plan went into action on February 9th. Leclerc landed in Le Cap as detachments sailed off to occupy the other major ports. Henri Christophe garrisoned Le Cap and was in the process of welcoming Leclerc just as Toussaint stole into town. Toussaint literally eavesdropped from a side room as Christophe and Leclerc parleyed. It was demanded that the predominantly black garrison disband and relinquish control of Fort Liberté to white troops. Christophe rejected these demands, promising to raise Le Cap if Leclerc tried anything funny. In the first of many mistakes he would make during the expedition, Leclerc underestimated Haitian resolve. When the following day he ordered Fort Liberté stormed, Christophe ordered his troops to fire in the city with cannon, and then race around with torches and set anything and everything on fire. Le Cap burned as he retreated into the rocky interior. It's here that the war began in earnest, but despite a fierce display of defiance at Le Cap, things went very poorly for Toussaint. Half of Toussaint's 20,000 professional soldiers defected to the French, and Boudet captured Port Républicain and the entire Haitian treasury. Dessalines was defeated at Croix de Bouquet, losing Saint-Marc. Before long, all of the ports in major cities were under French control, including those on the Spanish side of Santo Domingo. Feeling that he had Toussaint on the ropes, Leclerc offered an amnesty, as per instructions. A missive was sent to Toussaint along with his sons, guaranteeing humane treatment for an immediate surrender. This Toussaint wisely rejected. If Leclerc wanted him, he'd have to fight through the mountainous tropical interior of Haiti. So though their initial advance had been a stunning success, the French would now have to face an experienced and embittered enemy, drilled in the European fashion and skilled at guerrilla war. Constant skirmishing wore down the French, but not so severely as disease and deprivation. Yellow fever and malaria decimated French forces, killing or incapacitating thousands from February to March. In a frank letter sent to Napoleon, Leclerc admitted, "I am here without food or money. The burning of Le Cap and the districts through which the rebels retired deprives me of all resources. It is necessary that the government send me provisions, money and troops. That is the only means of preserving Saint-Domingue." In the same letter, Leclerc would go on to say that he would not do business with Americans because some were Jewish, and Leclerc himself was, in addition to being an incorrigible racist, an intense anti-Semite. Some 8,000 reinforcements would be sent over the next few months, but it did little to help in the short term. Toussaint knew that the rainy season, usually around the middle of the year, would bring with it another wave of disease. He only had to resist until disease did the killing for him. To buy time, Toussaint and Christophe launched localized counterattacks around Gonaïves. The fighting was brutal and bloody, casualties invariably higher on the Haitian side. Embroiled in this fighting, Toussaint was driven back by a counterattack from Leclerc. Advancing in the direction of Vertet, he overran entire rebel units and accepted the defection of one of Toussaint's best subordinates, General Maurepas. Now, only the fortress at Crête-et-Pirot stood between Leclerc and victory. Dug into a steep mountain top, well stocked with ammunition and provisions, Dessalines and the garrison of Crête-et-Pirot resisted for several weeks. All of the French commanders, de Gouin, Rochambeau, Boudet and even Leclerc, were wounded in the fighting. 1,500 of their men were killed in repeated assaults. Napoleon's careful step-by-step plan meant nothing in this vicious attritional war. Napoleon's strategy was that which had worked so well in Italy, a war of rapid manoeuvre. Toussaint's was the Fabian strategy, to bleed the French dry. As Crête-et-Pirot fought on, Toussaint snuck north and rallied the Haitians to the cause not just of emancipation, but for the first time, independence. His regular forces, reinforced by a guerrilla army, raced to Dessalines' aid, but too late to save Crête-et-Pirot. The fortress fell, the defenders massacred. But here Leclerc faltered. The first drops of the rainy season fell in April, and with almost his entire army now in the mountains, in the jungle, at the worst time of the year, tropical disease absolutely annihilated his army, and Toussaint's persistent attacks inflicted even greater losses. At this stage, Toussaint dispatched a letter to Napoleon, entreating him to replace Leclerc with someone reasonable, and have them withdraw to the ports, whereupon a peace could be had. Of course, Napoleon never replied, so Toussaint turned to diplomacy with Leclerc. He had Henri Christophe agree to meet Leclerc and talk terms. It was a mistake. Christophe was assured that he and his officers would keep their commands if they joined the expedition. Tired of Toussaint's tight leash, Christophe defected, depriving the Haitians of 1,200 regular troops and 100 cannon. Dessalines defected not long after. With the loyalty of his officers waning, Toussaint agreed to an armistice. Meeting at Le Cap on May 6th, Leclerc offered Toussaint the lieutenancy general, 2IC to Leclerc himself. It had been a habit of Haitian rebels to surrender on such terms as these, assured of comfort and prosperity. Toussaint knew, however, that comfort for him meant, eventually, the re-enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Haitians. Besides, it was too good to be true. As we know, Leclerc did intend to betray the rebels as soon as he could. So the wily Toussaint refused, time still on his side. Even with the end to active fighting, disease continued to ravage the French army. In desperation, Leclerc falsified letters home, embellishing his success, denying defeats. What he did admit, however, was the frightful scale of disease. 3,600 men in hospital, 250 more each day, with only 1 in 5 surviving. He pleaded for 25,000 reinforcements that Napoleon was very reluctant to send. The combination of treachery and defeat left Toussaint very isolated, now spending the rest of 1801 and early 1802 tending to his plantations. It was in this lull that Leclerc and Dessalines conspired to seize Toussaint. On June 9, 1802, a meeting was arranged at his headquarters, and assured of good faith and intentions, Toussaint agreed. His suspicions that it was a trap were confirmed when guards rushed in with bayonets raised. He and his family were arrested and bundled up on a fast frigate before any alarm could be raised. Back in France within a few weeks, Toussaint was incarcerated in Fort de Joux, high in the Jura Mountains, and not far from the Swiss border. Here he would remain until in April 1803 he succumbed to illness and malnutrition. Between the falsified reports of Leclerc and the arrest of Toussaint, Napoleon felt confident that the time was right to reimpose slavery. On May 20th, laws were passed in Saint-Domingue, Martinique and Guadeloupe, confining the blacks to plantations, stripping those of mixed race of their civil rights, and prescribing miscegenation, even deporting white women with black husbands to France. In every particular, it was a return to the codified racism of the Ancien Regime. It was also the beginning of the end for the French in Haiti. Riled up by Toussaint's deportation, and now re-enslaved, the Haitians dove straight back into rebellion. Leclerc found himself putting out fires, quite literally, across the entire island. Losses to disease and a grueling guerrilla war mounted quickly. Around 2/3 of Leclerc's army were casualties. This left too few troops to successfully occupy the island, and the French were again confined mostly to the port cities. Only the native troops commanded by Dessalines and Christophe had any success. On Leclerc's orders, they ruthlessly suppressed the rebellion, but the cracks were beginning to show. Dessalines was a black supremacist and wanted the whites gone from Haiti. Christophe was promised power and prestige if he double-crossed the French, neither of which were forthcoming. In October 1802, both rejoined the rebellion to fight for an independent Haiti. The writing was on the wall for Leclerc. In these final desperate months of occupation, Leclerc begged to retire and for reinforcements to be sent. With tensions between France and Britain reigniting, Napoleon refused to help even if he demanded success. Now quite literally abandoned in Haiti, Leclerc's only effective tool was terror. In a letter to Napoleon, he admitted that his war was now one of racial extermination. In every town and city the French controlled, mass executions were commonplace. The brutality was unimaginable. Ships were loaded up with black prisoners and scuttled. When this didn't prove quick enough, smoke was pumped into the brigs like a kind of early gas chamber. One by one, French cities fell and counter-massacres were perpetrated against whites and those of mixed race. By early 1803, only Le Cap remained in French control, garrisoned by the shattered remnant of a once mighty expeditionary force. Leclerc's racism and cruelty assumed sadistic form. He had slaves mauled by dogs, castrated and tortured. Bodies, black and white, were left to rot in the street. Leclerc was soon among the dead. Sometime in October he contracted yellow fever and was dead within the month. No one mourned him, least of all Napoleon, who recalled Pauline in November. Rochambeau was now in charge, and if you can believe it, he was even worse than Leclerc. Occupying one of the few intact halls in Le Cap, Rochambeau hosted orgic feasts. At midnight, mixed-race wives and sisters were forced to watch as their husbands and brothers were murdered before the women themselves were killed. The expedition lingered on for another year, receiving another 20,000 reinforcements. In December 1803, Rochambeau negotiated his surrender. He then gathered up the remaining 8,000 men of the original expedition and retreated to France, but only after massacring every single black or mixed-race Haitian they could get their hands on. The Leclerc expedition had been from start to end a miserable fuck-up. The cost in blood for both sides had been extreme. 40,000 French, Polish, Dutch and Swiss soldiers, and perhaps as many as 350,000 Haitians. Saint-Domingue, Haiti, was little more than a burned-out husk. Its cities were in ruins, its economy devastated, its people accustomed only to death and violence. And for Napoleon, not only was the expedition an unmitigated disaster, it was an unforced error. There are several major mistakes Napoleon makes during his career. I'd consider the Egyptian expedition the first. If it's not the first though, the Leclerc expedition most certainly is. Napoleon's colonial ambitions died in Haiti. Saint-Domingue was forever lost to the French. Having realized the magnitude of the failure by mid-1803, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the Americans, recouping some of the lost treasure squandered on Haiti. Had that money been invested in the island, had Napoleon sought an accord with the eminently reasonable Toussaint, had he not let prejudice cloud his judgment and seen the quality of the black soldiers and workers of Saint-Domingue, things might have played out very differently. But it was all too late now. In private, Napoleon saw the error of his ways, confessing that it was, quote, the gravest error my government ever committed. For the first consul, things would go from bad to worse. While the Leclerc expedition sapped France's power, Britain rebuilt its strength in preparation for renewed hostilities. Dundas and Pitt were wringing their hands with glee, Haiti proving that Napoleon was far from infallible. France could no longer claim to be the home of the revolution, but the consulate was still a grave threat to British designs on the continent. Victorious French arms, or bottomless reserves of British cash, which one would break first?